Okay, in this lecture, so let me give you some overview of it. Let's talk about the background. What is the continuity from the midterm part then? Remember when we talk about the macroeconomics models, previously we talked about the macroeconomics indicator. Recall that we have two groups of the macroeconomics indicator. Macroeconomic indicator. The first one is in terms of what we call GDP. Remember what is GDP? Thank you. This is for short, we call it is nation's income. We believe that if we have more income, then this will imply that our well-being will be higher. However, it's may not that true. If we have more income, but what we pay for in terms of goods and services is also expensive, then our well-being may not be that good, right? So the other group that we study is in terms of the cost of living, which measure in terms of inflation or price level. We name this one as cost of living. No matter what, we said one of the factor that seem to be really important is in terms of GDP because yeah, we need to have the income first. No matter how price level is, whether the goods is good, cheap or expensive, we need to have the money. If we don't have money, we cannot buy anything, right? So that in a country, think about if you are the policy maker or the government. GDP is the target variables of a country. Target indicator of the country. And it's important. We use GDP to measure the economic growth from GDP level. So over the years, assume that this is the graph that represents the growth of GDP over the years. Horizontals we measure in terms of time, and the vertical is in terms of GDP value. The country needs to estimate its potential GDP. Potential GDP is not the straight line with the positive slope. Like when times pass, next year, next 2 years, yes, we expect to have GDP higher and higher. But most of the country they don't believe in the linear growth of GDP. What they expect is to have what we call the exponential growth, like this. Let's define this one as potential GDP. However, over the years, yes, we expect that we're going to have this much of the GDP growth. However, there's lots of the events to the world economy, like pandemic that we have previously, the trade war, or even the new prime minister of the United States that affects our country GDP growth. So actual GDP, yeah, may not exactly the same to the potential GDP. Assume that the green one is what we call actual GDP. So we would see that there might be some period that we have actual more than the potential one, or we have the potential one higher than the actual. So this is what we term as economic fluctuations. So basically, if potential GDP is more or less than actual GDP, we said this create the problems, which is in terms of the economic fluctuations. The question is, how could we develop the models to explain the economic fluctuations? So the key questions of this lecture is to have the models to explain economic fluctuations, which is the one which is really similar to the microeconomics one. So the problem is that keep in mind actual GDP is not equal to the potential GDP. And the models that is used to explain the macroeconomic fluctuations is what we term as aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Or for short, we call this is ADAS models. What is it? It is the macroeconomics model. Why do we need to have it? Because we gonna use to explain economic fluctuations. So for short, we're gonna call this one as AD and AS models. So the vertical axis, once again, we have study this one in really details. We term it as the price level. This for short, we use P as a notations, but don't forget that P is not in the dollar term. It is price level, which is CPI that we used previously. And in terms of the horizontal axis, this is the quantity of output, or we name this one as Y, or this one is the GDP level. You see, the upward slope graph is what we call aggregate supply. For short, we call this is AS, and the downward slope is aggregate demand. Once we have the intersection point of this, we're gonna have, this one is the equilibrium, and we have GDP equilibriums as well as price equilibriums with respect to the current situations of our economy. Why do we have economic fluctuations? That is because of changes in the equilibrium. For example, if you have supply shift to the right, new equilibrium is here, so we have GDP higher. But if you have demand shift to the left, new equilibrium is here, so GDP level become this much. So we have the contractions over the GDP level. So this is what we term as economic fluctuations. Well, if you are asked why we have economic fluctuations by using this model, that is because of we have changes of the equilibrium. We have equilibriums because of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. If one of these two change, aggregate supply and or demand, then we're going to have the new equilibriums, and this will lead to the economic fluctuations. Okay, changes of E will lead to the economic fluctuations. So the question now move to aggregate demand and supply in detail. Similar to the lecture before midterm examinations, we talk about the loanable fund market. We need to start with supply and demand. What is it, and what is the determinants of demand and the supply? Then we have two key questions in this part too. The first one, what is it? Which means what is aggregate demand or aggregate supply? Well, we expect to know the definitions of it. Yeah, seem the same. The second question is when we know the definition, because shift of AD and AS will lead to changes in equilibriums, we need to understand what cause demands and supply chain in terms of determinants of AD or AS. What is in terms of definition and determinants that causative of AD and AS. So that in this lecture, before we move to the application of the AD and AS, then we will go over one by one and have a look at some details behind aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, so we have 3 parts of the lecture. And according to that 3 parts of the lecture, we have the checklist over what we call expected outcome. The first one, we need to define what influence aggregate supply and aggregate demand and how to use it to explain trends and the fluctuations of the economy, economic growth, inflations, and all those things. How to use it to explain trends and the fluctuations. According to these rationales, we have 2 key questions. Okay. This one, right? No. According to these 2 key questions, and one thing is about the applications, then we have 3 parts of the lecture. One is in terms of the details of AD and AS. Okay, we're going to have 2 sets of the question like this, and then how to use it to explain the economic fluctuations that we call trends and the fluctuations of the economy. We're going to start one by one. From the first one is aggregate supply. All right, so let's start from the first question. What is it, aggregate supply? Am I too slow? Okay, aggregate supply, what is it? Well, it is nothing then when we have asked this kind of question. So it's like we want to know what is the definitions of the aggregate supply. When talking about demand or supply in economics, we usually refer to the quantity that supply in the economy. In this case, is the quantity supplied of the real GDP. Okay, AS refer to real GDP. Why it is real GDP? That is because you see the horizontal axis. In my graph, I said this is the aggregations of the output, right? So as to refer GDP to the output, we use real GDP because we remove the price effect and focus on quantity produced. Quantity produced and sold in economy. The quantity of what final goods and services. So this one is similar to the microeconomics one because the parties who produce is firm or the producer. So once we define aggregate supply in this way, so we can write that aggregate supply, it is nothing. It is refer to the quantity of real GDP. Let me write for short, which is Q. So the question is how to have this Q more or less. We can say this Q, the quantity, depends on production function or production process. In mathematics, we may term that Q depends, mathematics is functions of production process. It's the process that we convert inputs, production inputs, to be the quantity. And the next question is, what are the economic inputs that we consider? So right here, you remember, right? It's equal to land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial talents or entrepreneurship skill. So we have 4 types of the input, but actually it's too much. So we can group, remember when we talk about economic growth, this production function also depends on the four types of the input. However, look at this, capital and land are really close. In case of the accounting, they said this one is the fixed asset, right? If we have used that this one, the capitals, I mean the working capital, that would be still is the asset, but short-term asset. Well, we term this one as K, which stand for capital for short, and use notation which is K. And for labor, and the other one, which is entrepreneurial, still, if you remember the definition of labor, it is numbers of the worker that we provide in terms of how many hours within the week or within the year. No matter uh, we use our effort or really technical skill in terms of the entrepreneurial talents. Still, we can term these two in the same factors because still they are the labor. The other factor is in terms of labor. For short, we call this is L. So that this quantity is a functions of input. If we try to simplify the input, then it's equal to L and K, which is capital. To make it simple, we assume that K is fixed. Assume K is fixed. Well, there might be some case that we allow for K chain, but taking this way that quantity or aggregate supply is a function of input, basically equal to L and K. That's it. What is this Q? Q is once again real GDP. Because we said real GDP, we focus on the quantity. So that's why we can write it is equal to Q. All right. Now, let's move to something a bit complicated, because when talking about economic study, we have two periods of analysis. The first one is long term, and second is the short term, right? Previously, we focused on Q. That Q or real GDP, maybe the first one is at full employment, or is in a short term, follow the business cycle. Taking this way, that regarding that Q, this is long-term Q or long-term GDP, but for the business cycle, this is short-term. So the next question is, what's the difference? What is difference between them? So let's look at the first one. We said at the full employment. Yeah, keep in mind that because I said this is in the long term. At the full employment, sometimes we call this one as long term or long run GDP, or we may call full employment GDP, or we may call this is potential GDP. What the implications of the long run? I prefer using this word, which is called full employment of the GDP. What does it mean? Full employment is this imply that all resources are fully utilized. Or fully employed. So take it that, remember the framework ADAS models. Right now we focus on AS. If this is Y or GDP and this is price, no matter how much price is, because all resources are fully utilized, we cannot produce it anymore. We don't have more available resources. So that's why long-term GDP is vertical. This is what we call YF. So for short, all of this we denote by YF, stand for long run GDP. This one we may term as, the maximum level of GDP at its full potential. Maximums at its full potential, I mean. Or we can say this is long run AS. However, remember, over the business cycle, we may have the fluctuations of this Q. So over the business cycle, let's say this is in the short run analysis. So what the implication in short run? Because we make assumptions that all resources are fully utilized in the long run, but in the short run, still we have some resources available. Some resources are available. So think if you are the producer, if price is higher, will you produce more or less? We will produce more, right? Because we're gonna have more revenue. We will produce more. For example, if right now price equal to P0 and you produce up here, Y0, but now price become higher, which is P1. In the short run, you may plan to produce more because of you can get higher revenue and some resources are also available. So that in the short run, when talking about the aggregate supply, it is the upward slope. This is short run aggregate supply. SR stand for short run. LR stand for long run. Nothing in this slide. Just to let you know that we have two types of the graph. Vertical is long run. Upward slope is the short run. So later we will see why we have the different shape of the aggregate supply. Any question? Why is vertical? That is because we have resources are fully utilized. All right. Okay. Nothing. Just want to ask you to put the notes right here. The next slide is to talk about the graph. Graph of aggregate supply. Well, it's just normal supply that you have studied previously. Follow the law of supply. Assume that right now you are a producer. If price is higher, law of supply suggests that the quantity will be higher, but quantity in this case we measure in terms of aggregate supply. Assume this is short run, but if price is drop, we intend to produce less. Q is aggregate supply, right? Because right now we measure all the quantity within the economy. So in the slide, we are told that if price level higher, then wow, it's good time to make profit. Then we're gonna supply more of the output. But if it is really bad time for the price is lower, then we're gonna supply lower. That there is a decrease in aggregate supply. That's it. So we're gonna have this kind of graph, which is the upward slope, but keep in mind that this is the short run aggregate supply. Something like this. You see, price higher, we produces more. Then we're gonna talk about this one, which is the different shape of short run and long run. Even though we know already why we have different shape, but we want to know something in details regarding the mechanism why we have the different shape. We explain those things from using the money weight or money prices of the input cost, money term, and yes, this is the graph where we have potential and we explain, we're going to answer this one. Why AS curve slope upward in the short run and vertical in the long run. Okay, let me sum up for you then. Okay, the previous slide, what is the key point? The key point is that we know that long run aggregate supply is vertical, but short run is upward slope. Why we have different shape? We ask the questions that why long run aggregate supply is vertical, but short run supply is upward slope. So short run is upward slope, long run is vertical. We ask the question why. Well, we know something in explanations that we use from the microeconomics. However, this is macroeconomic subject. So we need to find some more explanations as to explain the entire economy. It's like we ask the questions for what is the factor behind difference of the graph, shape of the graph, of the curve. However, before we move to find the answer of what is that factor, let's make the assumption for this analysis that assume we have lots of the assumption then. The first one, once again, we have AS, remember, this is in terms of the quantity. And quantity is a function of L and K. In the short run, right now, assume that we fix K for what? For simplicity. Okay, let's assume further K is fixed for simplicity. So if we want to increase Q, then we need to use L more. If Q, we want to produce more, then assume that we use only L. Or this is the second. If producer want to produce Q more, then they need to use L more. This L is in quantity terms, quantity of labor. And number three, what is the decision to use more or less quantity of labor? Let's say decision to use how many labors. let's say it is depends on what we call real wage. Remember, when we have income, we're going to consume more or less, depends on the real income. In this case as well, real wage, if it's lower, wow, the factor is very cheap. We're going to use L more. If we use L more, then we can produce more. Aggregate supply will be higher. Right? So what is the real wage then? Real wage is equal to nominal wage, or in the text, in the slide, we use the word money wage and then divide by price level. However, number 4 of the assumption, we assume that in the short run, the nominal or the money wage is fixed, cannot be changed. Why? In the short run, within 1 year, assume that this nominal wage is the minimum wage. As you see from the history, it doesn't change more frequently, right? Maybe within 5 years, or in some country up to 10 years. So 10 years is not the short term. Short term is within a year. So in this case, we say nominal or money wage is fixed in short run, but changeable in long run. Okay, these are assumptions before we move to explain why we have a different shape of aggregate supply. Okay, let me wait for you 10 seconds. Okay, let's start from the first case where we have short run. What is the graph of aggregate supply in the short run? We said short run aggregate supply is upward slope. What is the mechanism behind upward slope of the short run aggregate supply then? We said, okay, let's start from this graph. This is Y and this is P. Let me shift it to the left then. Assume that we start from this point, which is A. Point A. Well, I start in the middle because aggregate supply may be up to this much, or in these directions, or up to these directions. At this point, we have Y equal to this much, Y0, and this is price, which is P0. Let's start in this way, that in the short term at point A, we have aggregate supply equal to Y0. Right now, assume that price is higher to P1. This is by assumption. So we may assume in the other directions where price is drop. So assume price is higher. If price is higher, so let's see what will be the result on changes in aggregate supply then. Would it be higher, lower, or it is fixed? So we start from this. Price is higher if you are producer and this is in short run. We are suggest that the decisions to produce subject to the real wage. And we know that real wage equal to nominal divided by price level. So what will be the effect on the real wage? Remember, in the short run, the nominal wage is fixed. It is fixed in the short run. Then the upper term is fixed, unchanged. So look at me. Right now, price level is higher. So real wage will be higher or lower? Lower. When real wage is lower, then real cost of labor is lower. L is lower. Should we use more or less in terms of quantity of labor? Because cost is lower, then we can afford more labor. Am I right? We can buy more because it's cheaper. Real cost is cheaper. So quantity, these notations stand for quantity of labor. Sorry. So quantity of labor is higher, you see, because, look at me, because labor, we can use more, then Q will be higher. We use more L, then we can produce more. Produce Q more, or this is the case where we have aggregate supply higher to AS1. So you see, if P is higher, then quantity and aggregate supply will be higher because what? We have a cheaper of the real wage. So assume that aggregate supply higher to this much, which is AS1. Oops. Let's say by this much. This is Y1. And at this price, so we can say that this is the short run aggregate supply. Am I right? This is in the short run. 10 seconds. Any question, please? So something a bit more complicated is about the long run. What is the shape of long run aggregate supply? It's vertical. Let's try to look at why we have the vertical long run aggregate supply. Okay, we're going to use the previous graph as well. So in the long run, taken this way, recall that all resources are fully utilized. All resources as well as labor are fully utilized. Let me use the word employed. So this implies that the quantity of labor is fixed. Fully employed. Labor are fully employed. So that numbers of labor is no more available. Or we have the fixed quantity of labor. Then let's start from the previous case. At point A, yes, we have this much of aggregate supply. However, right now, assume that we have price higher. Price higher to be P1 by this much. Then what will be the effect on AS? The point is that because this is in the long run, no matter price is higher, then because of L is fixed, labor is fixed, we cannot use it more or no more available. What is the implication of this? When L is fixed, remember the decisions to use L depends on real wage. Decision to use L depends on real wage, which is this term. Okay, look at me. Because we assume L is fixed, we cannot use more L. Then real wage should be increased, decreased, or constant. Must be constant, right? This implies that the real wage must be constant term. For example, if I assume that price increased by 20%, we multiply by 1 plus 20, this is gonna be the new price. Look at me. So as to have the real wage fixed, then the money wage will also increase, right? In the long term, we said money wage is flexible, it's changeable. Money wage changed by how many percent? Must be also by 20%. Must be also by 20%. Why? That is because we're gonna cancel out this term. And then money wage will be at the same. So in this case, we can sum up that. For example, if P increase, for example, by 20%. Well, normally, if we are in the short run, we said producer want to produce more. Want to produce more Q. And use L higher. However, we have no L available. The implication from this is that the effect of price change, the effects of price higher is only on nominal wage higher. At the same 20%. Or at the same rate. So this leads to real wage constant. In terms of quantity of labor will also be constant. So that quantity and aggregate supply is at the same rate, which is AS 0, or yeah, we use Y0. This is the case where we term it as full employment. So the point is that The point is that price increase because no more L is available. So the effect would be on nominal and money wage increase at the same rate. So that real wage at the same quantity of labor, there is no change of aggregate supply. So we have Y0 at the same point of aggregate supply at Y0, which is what we term as full employment. So any question, please? Okay, let's get back to the graph. How does this look like? If P increase to be P1, P increase to P1, in the long run, aggregate supply at the same level, which is AS0 or Y0, which is this one. Even P equal to P1, still aggregate supply equal to this much. Let's say it's this point. This is AS0 still. So we have this graph of the long run aggregate supply then, which is vertical. Yeah, actually, we just take that in the long run, there is no more resource available. So that's why no matter how price is, then we have the fixed quantity. That's it. Because you have me, so that I try my best to confuse you. You look so tired, huh? What happened? You look so sleepy too. Okay. Nothing. Just, take it simple that aggregate supply in macroeconomics models is the same to supply in microeconomics. Still, we have the upward slope. The difference is that we classify the analysis to be short run and long run. Short run, we have upward slope. Long run, we have vertical because we utilize all the resources already. So that's why we have it vertical. Well, the other thing, which is the second question, is what are the determinants of the aggregate supply? It's like the questions we asked that, can we change? Do we have the case of aggregate supply change? The answer is yes, aggregate supply change when potential GDP change because of quantity of labor or the resources, quantity in terms of technology, as well as in terms of the money wage or money price of those resources. So this is slide number 15. We have the case of 16 that shift the graph, and the case of 17, long run and short run of aggregate supply. We discussed this one already. So let me sum up for you. To this case, it's like we ask the questions that, can aggregate supply change? The answer must be yes. Can AS change? Yeah, the answer must be yes. Assume that we have this graph of aggregate supply. This is P and this is Y, stand for the level of GDP. Well, let me ask you to review. We have two cases of the change. The case number one, remember, is called move along. Move along case is where we have changes in price. For example, if we have price higher, then we produce more. So this is the aggregate supply. This is the case where we call aggregate supply. Sorry, move along. This is AS0. But for this one, AS change, let's focus on, the general case where we call shift of aggregate supply. Focus on shift of AS. We ask the questions, what are the factors behind the shift of aggregate supply? So before we answer these questions, let's recall that we want to know, right? What caused changes in aggregate supply? We said aggregate supply is quantity anyway. Quantity depends on the production function, which is in terms of L and changes of K. If we have changes of K and L, the input use, then quantity change, aggregate supply would be shift. So to generalize these questions, we said L and K is changes of input used by the producer. So it's like we ask the questions, what is the factor behind changes of the ability to use the input of the producer? So it's like we ask the questions, factors behind the ability to use factors to use input by the producer. So the first one, let me group it for you. The first group of these factors depends on the quantity available. Quantity of inputs available. What is it? Like, remember, we have factor input, which is land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship skill. If you have land higher, labor, which means we expand the area which could be used for the production area, like in case of Singapore or Hong Kong. Okay, we have land more, then produce more. We can produce more, then Q higher, aggregate supply will be higher. Labor in terms of the quantity, capital higher, as well as the entrepreneurship skill higher. Then we can have changes in aggregate supply. For example, let me introduce you two of the example. One is that if we allow for free visa for foreign worker, must be talent worker. Free visa, for example, if our company want to attract the foreigner, one of the barrier attract the foreigner to work in Thailand is about the visa permit that they need to renew, regularly. Sometimes they are not longer permit to work in the Thailand. So if the government implement free visa, so that would be more talent worker. more talent worker. This talent worker equal to L. Like we have more, this one in terms of quantity of labor is higher. So we have quantity of labor higher, then we can produce more. So Q and aggregate supply will be higher. Like in this case, shift to the right, A is 1. So this is from the first example. However, there might be the other case that because of the economic or economy environment in Thailand is not really friendly right now, so that foreign investor move their production to, for example, Vietnam. Foreign investor move production to Vietnam because they are advanced economy, emerging economy. So what did they move? They moved the production in terms of capacity, investment, machinery, and all those things. So in this case, in terms of the production, we may link to unit of the capital, right? Quantity of capital in the country is lower. So that's because we have Q lower, quantity of capital lower, we can produce less as well as aggregate supply will be lower to Q2 in this case. So assume that Q2 is aggregate supply shift to the left where it's decreased, AS2. So the first group of the factors is in terms of the quantity available. If you have more quantity available, we can use it more. And the second group, quantity and price. Let's say price or cost of input. You can guess, right? If we have more price or cost of the input, like if price is higher, then we can afford less input. We can produce less. Q will be lower as well as aggregate supply will be lower depending on the cost. Let's look at example. One of the classic examples is in terms of the minimum wage. Like in case of Thailand, we just launched a new rate of the wage that if minimum wage is higher, so cost of labor cost of L will be higher so that we can use less L. Less means in terms of the quantity. So that aggregate supply will be lower to be this one. Okay, where is this is AS2 shift to the left. What else? I think the other classic is in terms of the fuel price that we actually use in all the process of production. If the fuel price is higher, really fluctuated anyway. If price is higher, then yeah, because I said this is some key, component in the production process, we can say cost of input is higher, then we use it less. So quantity and aggregate supply will be lower. We can produce less. And the other example, let's talk about a bit complicated case where we have exempted tax for the imported machine. Exempted import tax for off machine. This is exempted. Hopefully my spelling is correct. Like normally, if we buy the machine in our factory, like $100, which is the price, the government would tax that like 10%. So the actual price we pay $110. But now we are allowed to pay tax equal to zero. We are allowed not to pay the tax. So they remove 10% of tax and we pay only $100. So price of the machine will be lower. Price of machine. I mean the gross price, the total price. Let's say gross price of machine is lower. When price of machine is lower, we can use more K, right? Machines is capital. We use K more. So in terms of quantity and aggregate supply will be higher. And shift to the right. So this is the second group. Any question, please? This is the second group. The last group of this one, we can say it is the other factors. That in economics, other factors we call external shock. External shock could be positive or negative shock to the economies, or for simplicity, let's say this is the other factors. It could be positive. We can say that positive will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. But if it's negative, reduce in the aggregate supply. It could be positive or it could be negative. Okay, let's look at very classic examples of the external shock. The first one is in terms of technology and innovation. Do you think this is positive or negative? This is clearly positive. Our production process has more technology, so efficiency will be higher. We have more efficiency, then we can produce more. Quantity and aggregate supply will be shifted to the right. The other classic examples is in terms of natural disaster or the pandemic. Well, like we have the severe floods, we have some depression, we have some other thing, landslides that cause an effect on our production process. So basically, this one is the negative shock. This is negative. especially the pandemic. Once we have pandemic, we need to close down our production plants. In terms of number of labor is lower, so we can produce less. Q and aggregate supply would be drop to AS2. And some other factors could be like sometimes our aggregate supply depends on the world economy. Like we have the supply chain disruption, shortage of some materials because of war. Mhm. That affects the shipment of the materials or may depends on the internal political affairs, political issues, etc. That also affect negatively on our production process. So we can say these are the three, basically, these are the negative shock. But some is positive though. Let me remove the directions like world economy if it's good, more of the investment would come to Thailand. We have more K, so aggregate supply may shift to the right. But right now we talk about the supply chain disruption would be the negative side. Then aggregate supply should be shifted to the right, to the left as well. So these are the three groups of factors underlying the aggregate supply. So it could be shifted to the left or to the right, depending on what? The ability of the firm to use the input. So this ability depends on first quantity available. If we have more quantity available, it is more likely that we can use more inputs, produce more, aggregate supply would be shifted to the right. But if price is higher, second group, the other factors depend on price. If price is higher, in general, we afford to use less inputs. So we produce less, aggregate supply will be shifted to the left. And the other one is other factors, which is termed as the external shock. Okay, that's all for the aggregate supply. Any question, please? The next one is aggregate demand. The next slide, we already talked about short run and long run aggregate supply already. Should we take a break first before we move to AD? Okay, because if we continue AD, then gonna be a long story. Let's take a break for 15 minutes. Right now it's 14:15, 14:30. Any question, please? Okay, only few more points of today. So if we finish this all, that would be low for today anyway, because we just talk about the models. We finish the first one, which is aggregate supply, and then let's continue the next one, which is aggregate demand, and mix them up together. We have the macroeconomics equilibriums and try to explain the types of the equilibriums we may have in the macroeconomics models. Okay, we talked about this already. Let's move to this one. Aggregate demand. Okay, once again, first let's ask the questions. What is it in terms of the aggregate demand? The question is, what is it? Or what is aggregate demand? Once again, in economics, when we talk about demand or supply, we try to quantify that thing in terms of the quantity, supply, or demand. In this case, we move to quantity demand. Quantity of what? Quantity of real GDP. Quantity of real GDP. Well, right here, we talk about the demand side of our macroeconomic, right? So recall that demand is what? Demand is the demand for final goods to consume. Actually, it's final goods and services. And if you remember, this demand is nothing. Demand is like the expenditure of the entire economy from all key economic sectors. So it is expenditure. So remember, in GDP calculation, so we have expenditure approach to calculate GDP. GDP from the expenditure approach. Is what is this term? GDP or Y equal to C plus I plus G plus X and minus M. So this is the formula of GDP from expenditure approach. And we said this expenditure is nothing. It is the demand of our economy. So that we can say that if we are asked what is aggregate demand in our economy, aggregate demands in our economy is components. Yeah, it's from C, I, G, and X minus M. This is actually the components of aggregate demand. Or AG. So if we are asked what is the determinant of the aggregate demand, then so we can write that aggregate demand its functions. Aggregate demand depends on means we can write as the functions of components of the aggregate expenditure, which is C, I, G, and X minus M. Let me classify X and M away. So we can have this function of the aggregate demand. We just sum all of this and then we would get the aggregate demand. So if there is something change, some factor leading to changes in C, I, G, or X minus M, then Y will change and aggregate demand would be changed. That's it. So this one is quite simple. Take that demand equal to the expenditure. What is the expenditure of our economy? C, I, G, X, and minus M. That's it. So how's about the graph? Graph of the aggregate demand. Well, it's just normal demand. Follow law of demand that if price is really expensive, P higher. But once again, this is not in terms of dollar, it is the price level. If price is higher, then aggregate demand, quantity demanded would be lower. If price is lower, we can afford the quantity more. So aggregate demand will be higher. We have an inverse directions between price and the quantity demanded. So it's like, yeah, in the slide that we have, if price is really expensive, we have a decrease in quantity demanded. But if price is very cheap, yeah, we can afford more increase in quantity demanded. That's it. Then we have this kind of graph of the demand. If price cheap, then we can consume more and more. We can spend more. Yeah, depending on the price. Then the next question is that can aggregate demand change? Well, it's like formal patterns when we study any markets, right? Start from the definitions, start from the determinants, and then we mix them up. In case of aggregate demand, we said the factor underlying changes in aggregate demand depending on all of these factors anyway. Well, and this will lead to AD increase, AD decrease. And the last point is about aggregate demand multiplier. Well, let me sum up for you in this way. Similar to the aggregate supply, we ask the questions, can AD change? The answer must be yes. The answer must be yes. And once again, we focus on the case of shifts of AD. Assume that we have this is graph of AD. This is Y and this is price. This is AD. No, this is AD 0. So once again, we have two types of the chain. If it's moved along, that is because of changes in this price. But right here, we focus on the case of shift in aggregate demand. So recall that what is the function of aggregate demand? We said aggregate demand is a function of C, I, G, X, and minus M. So if we have some factor leading to changes in this expenditure, or this is changes in demand, then this will lead to changes of the aggregate demand. So it could be shift to the left or to the right. Then let's look at the examples. I copy it from the slide. I copy it from the slide. And I have this case. Wow. The first one, help me. If you have more buying power of the money, should we pay more or less? We have more ability, we have more purchasing power. If we are the household, so we will pay more. Pay in this case, assume that we are the household. Household pay for more consumption, C is higher. If C is higher, then the quantity demanded will be higher. Aggregate demand would be shift to be AD1, which is the case of higher AD. So it could be shift up here, AD1, shift to the right. What is in terms of the real interest rate? So any factors that we have, we must link to C, I, G, X, and minus M. What if real interest rate higher? What is real interest rate? Remember from the loanable fund market, interest rate is the cost of using money, or this is cost of investment. If you have more cost of investment, then I will be lower, right? I is the components of aggregate demand. If I is lower, so aggregate demand would be lower to be AD2, which means we have shift of AD graph to the left in this direction to AD2. Am I right? Okay, the next one is we need to classify because we talk about the real price of export and import. Don't forget that import, we take the negative in front of it. If, okay, look at this. Price of export is higher. Can we export more or less? Our products is cheap, sorry, it's expensive from for the foreign country. So we can export less. Am I right? And this will lead to a drop. X is lower, leads to a drop in aggregate demand. Shift to AD2. However, if we talk about the price of import, is higher at the same direction. Who import? Thai people, right? Right now, price of import is very expensive. So we're gonna import M lower. However, let's have a look from the equations. We don't use the value of M, but what the value we use is minus M. If normal M is lower, negative of M will be higher. Am I right? So in this case, it's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Next one is about the expectations about the future. If we believe that in the future time, our economy is very good, if it is very good, then in the future, we're going to have more income. Right now, we will consume more. In the future, economy would be really good. Investment would be higher. So in this case, AD will be higher to AD1, for example. And the next one is in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. We will talk about this in details. This is the types of the government policy. It could be lead to a shift rightward of AD if the government try to expand the economy. It could be shift leftward if the government try to contract or slow down the economy growth. Then we're going to talk about it in details. And the next one is about the state of the world economy. Once again, it could be good or bad. For example, if we said we have the bad economy, so the consequence would be in the opposite directions. Because we believe that world economy would also affect Thai economy. Our consumption would be lower, investment would be lower, and yeah, we have a drop in aggregate demand to be AD2. So these are, the factor that leads to changes of aggregate demand, depending on, no matter the factor is, then we must link to CIGX minus M. And then if they ask you to explain, then we're gonna explain by in this way. Any question? Maybe it's too simple. Well, there is one point which is called the aggregate demand multiplier. We call this one is aggregate demand multiplier. What is the multiplier? We have one lecture that talk about this in very details, but let's take a short note that what is the aggregate demand multiplier? Okay. The formal definitions is on the next slide, but then let me sum up for you. What is the definitions of multiplier? Multiplier is somewhat magnify its original value, right? Aggregate demand multiplier, we define in this way that if we have or there are external change, let's say exogenous change of AD components, which is from what? Which is from, take it first. Investments. It's from government expenditure and from the import. If this change, then the final change on AD is greater than its original value. Okay, take it first. I will let you see how to explain. I will provide you with the examples. If you have exogenous change from these three components, exogenous change, okay, the final change on AD would be greater value. Okay, this is the key point. Greater value, greater than the original value. This is what we call the multiplier. Okay, let's look at this graph. Okay, we have this is Y and this is P. Assume that this is aggregate demand, which is AD0. And now we have price equal to this much, which is P0, which resulted in Y0. So we said at price, at P0, we have aggregate demand equal to Y0. Right now, let's assume that we have external change from investments. Assume we have I increase equal to 20 million. So the aggregate demand would be increased by 20 million. Do you agree? Because I is one component in the aggregate demand. So AD shift to the right, AD increase by 20 million to to Y0 plus 20, which is this line. This is AD1. Well, it's too much. Just tip up here. And this will be Y0 plus 20. So we said AD increased by 20, which is equal to I increase. Let's say this is the first step, and it is called the first round of AD change. Once I said this is the first round, then you would expect that we're going to have the second round, right? If it is equal to the original value, you see I increased by 20, exactly equal to 20 of AD chain, then we don't have the multiplier effect. But in most cases, we do have the multiplier effect. That is because AD higher, and this leads to Y higher, right? To be this much, Y plus 20. Y is what? Y is income. Is the nation income. If we have more income, then we're gonna consume more. C will be higher. And once again, because C is a component in aggregate demand, this will lead to AD to be higher. Right? So we define this one as the second round of AD change. This is the second round of AD change that leads to what we call the multiplier effects. So multiplier is from this stage that AD may be shift to this much, AD2, and we have, this level is Y0 plus 20 plus changes of C. This is changes of C. And for this one, it's changes of I, which is equal to 20. What is the value of C change? In the next lecture, we're gonna see that we can we can develop the models to quantify what is the multiplier effects. Okay, you see, because we have the second round, that make AD change more than $20 of investment change. Okay, the portions of delta C contribute to the multiplier effects in this regard. Okay, 10 seconds. Any question, please? Then the next part would be, very simple. Taking this way, aggregate supply is equal, it's like the normal supply, but in macro, we have short run and long run. In aggregate demand, well, also similar to the microeconomics one, except for factor underlying the chain of aggregate demand. And we have one more of the factor or point, which is called the multiplier effect. That's it. Everything is from the microeconomics one. Okay, once we have this, then we're going to use this model to explain what we call the economic fluctuations or the economic trends. How to? The first one, we need to have what is called the macroeconomics equilibriums. What is the macroeconomics equilibriums? The conditions of the equilibriums, because demand and supply we define in terms of the quantity. So equilibriums conditions is defined as quantity of real GDP demanded must be equal to the quantity of real GDP supply, or quantity of AD must be equal to the quantity of AS. This is in general case of the equilibrium conditions. Once we have it equal, then this is the equilibrium point of our macroeconomics models, where we have GDP equilibriums equal to 13 and price equilibriums equal to 110. And the adjustment toward the equilibriums are all the same to any markets. From that, if we have excess supply, where price is more than equilibriums, excess supply, everyone wanna sell, right? But then only few of the demand, then we need to lower the price. So price originally is 120 would be dropped to be 110 where we have the equilibrium. Similarly, if you have price lower than the equilibrium, only 100, we have excess demand. People demand for the final goods by this much, but the quantity available is at this level. So we want to consume. If you have the ability to pay more, we will do so as to get the products for consumption. So we will pay more until we reach the equilibrium point, equilibrium price at 110. The adjustment is the same. Macroeconomics equilibriums, all the details. Let me ask you to wrap up all of this. Okay, because it is the macroeconomics, so something would be more, complicated. Okay, let's look at this. It is the case of types of the equilibriums. Why we have many types of the equilibriums. Basically, we have full employment, recessionary, and inflationary gaps. Well, let me sum up for you. We're gonna go over these slides, this one, and also this one. Okay, let me sum up for you here then. Okay, we at this point it's like we ask the question that how to use this model, which is ADAS model, to explain economic fluctuation. Remember how we define the economic fluctuations. The fluctuations, we have it because of two types of the GDP. Recall that in most cases, we divide GDP into two terms. The first one is what we call potential GDP, or this is what we call full employment. Full employment GDP. And the other one is called actual GDP. How to get actual GDP? This is from ADAS model. So ADAS models is somewhat like this. This is P and this is Q. No, this is Y. I assume that this is AS and this is AD. If we have this one as the equilibrium, then this will be Y0, which is actual GDP. And this is P0, price equilibriums. So economic fluctuations happen because of the difference between potential and the actual GDP. Right now, we haven't plugged potential GDP into the graph, which we term as the full employment. So the scenarios of the equilibriums turn out to be three cases. For example, if you have potential GDP and then compare with the actual GDP, right now we have actual GDP equal to Y0, and potential GDP is the full employment, which is YF. Assume that if they are at the same point, do you think we have any problems? Do you think we have any problems? No, right? Because why potential GDP is important? That is because this is the level that all resources are utilized. If we are worker, we have the job to work and get some income for living. So in this case, it is the first type of the equilibriums where we call full employment equilibriums. Where is it? It's something like this. assume that this is YF. Okay, assume that YF is here. Full employment equal to Y0. This is what we call full employment equilibrium. So we can say that no problems, no economic problem. Why? Because all resources are fully employed. And GDP, let's say actual GDP is at the maximum level. Maximum level of GDP is where we utilize all resources. So that's why we said there is no problem. All resources are fully employed, no problems. However, if we have the difference between potential GDP and the actual GDP, like in this case, the second, let's start from the problems that if we have actual GDP less than potential GDP, do you think we have good economy? Our economy is good or bad? It's bad, right? Because we expect that the maximum level should be this much. However, the actual one is only this much. So it's like YF is not here. Potential GDP. Oops. So this is potential or full employment GDP is more than the actual one. So this is the case where we have the problems. Or let's say, or potential GDP, which is YF, is greater than Y0. We can say that actual GDP is quite low. Actual GDP is very low. This implies that we have the recession. We have recession problem. So the question is, if we are the government, we need to remove this recession problem, right? So the next question is, how much is the problem? How much is the problem? The problem in this case is the recession problems. To measure the recession problems, we call this one as the recessionary gap. This is the gap that we need to remove. How much is the gap? It must be the difference between actual and potential GDP. Or this gap equal to, we take the greater value, it must be the positive. We take YF minus Y0. Minus Y0. And we term this one as, the recessionary gap. Equal to this much. So this case, we have the recession problem, which is the second type of the equilibrium. Okay, any question, please? Once we have this one, the other one is called, it is the case where we have potential less than actual GDP. Let me wait for you 10 more seconds. Any question, please? Okay. So I heard that BBA student really fast learning. Mm. Now I believe that. This is number three. Potential GDP is less than the actual GDP. Why we have the problem? Look, actual GDP is more than what we estimated as the potential one. It seemed to be good, right? However, remember, this potential GDP is at is already the maximum output level of real GDP. But how come we have it more than the maximum level, right? So this is the problem. So we can say that it seemed to be good because we have YF less than the actual value more than what we estimated, which is the maximum value. So we can say, yes, it seemed to be good. But if you look into the detail, it's like this one is too good to be true. Seem impossible. One of the reason that make actual GDP greater than the potential one, that is because of the bubble. We may have the bubble problem. And this bubble is because of the high price level, let's say, or not equal, let's say, or high price level, which is called inflation problem. So I think let's use this maybe better. We have bubble or the inflation problems. Give me a second. Well, let me copy this one. Now we move to this case. So this is YF, and the problem is that we have YF less than the actual GDP. Assume that this is the case we have. Still, we term this one is the problem. The question is how to quantify the problem or how to measure the inflation problem. So these inflation problems in macroeconomics models we call inflationary gaps that we need to remove. Sorry, this is the case of the last type of the equilibriums, which is called the case where we have inflationary gap. So what is inflationary gaps? It must be the difference. It must be the difference between full employment GDP and the actual GDP. We take the greater term, which is Y0 minus YF. And this is what we term as inflationary gap. Okay, only one type of the equilibriums, which is full employment equilibrium, seem that we don't have any problems, right? Because we reached the maximum level of potential GDP. So to sum up, no matter it is recessions or inflationary gap, this create the problems to the entire economy, and there would be the long-term adjustment to remove this gap from our economy. So to sum up, in conclusion, no matter inflationary or recessionary gap, These are problems to the economy to remove and adjust actual GDP to be equal to potential GDP. So at the end, we want to have this one, actual GDP equal to full employment. So the question is how to reach it. How to reach, let's say, this condition where actual GDP equal to the full employment. So the first way is from the government helps, which is from, let's say, government policy. No matter it is fiscal or monetary policy. However, if you don't have the government help, in this case, we need to have what we call wait for the long-term adjustments. Long-term adjustments of macro economy. So, which is the case where we assume that we don't have governments. We have no helps from governments. Okay, let me read for you. In this lecture, we will assume that there is no government. We don't have any help from the government. And we would expect only for long-term adjustments in our macro economy. So how to remove the inflationary gaps then? All right. So let's have a look at the second case where we don't have the government. Assume we don't have government. The government is really useless. Assume that. Okay. Well, if we have recessionary gap and we have inflationary gap, these are all the detail. But let me sum up for you here. Whoop. So assume the second case and ask the question that how long-term adjustments of the macro economy where we don't have the government can help remove the inflationary and recessionary gap. Okay, we're gonna start one by one. Once again, we don't have the government. Let's start from the first case of recessionary gap. Why we have the problems? The economy is really bad. Bad in the sense that we have actual GDP Y0 less than full employment GDP. Okay, we call this is recessionary gap. Am I right? Okay, so assume that this is the graph This is Y, and this is P. This is aggregate supply, and this is aggregate demand. We have this is E0, Y0, and this is P0. Because we have full employment, we experience the recession. So full employment graph is somewhere here. Which is YF. Am I right? Okay, YF is greater than Y0. So we have the recession problem. So in this case, we have recession problem. We have the recession problem. Which is which can be quantified as what we call recessionary gap, which is equal to, okay, this one, this range, which is YF minus Y0. Right now, because we don't have the government, let's ask the questions, how long run adjustments of the market will remove the recessionary gap. Because we talk about the long run, let's see how long run adjustments can remove the recessionary gap. Okay, before we look at the mechanism, once again, this is the long run adjustments. Once again, let me ask you to recall that we have the assumptions in the long run analysis that aggregate supply equal to quantity. Right now, because we focus on the long run, L and K are flexible. Previously, we fixed K. But for simplicity, if we want to produce more Q, V stand for the producer, we need to use L more. And second, decision to use L. Okay. Decision to use the unit of L depends on, remember, the real wage. Real wage is equal to nominal wage divided by price level. And last one, with regard the nominal wage, the nominal wage is fixed in the short run, but right now we focus on the long run, so it's flexible, or let's say it's changeable. What is the mechanism then? So we have this kind of the problem. So, are you ready? You have been ready since yesterday. So, well, let's start from this way, that because of the recession, this is the case where we have really bad economy. We are not at the full employment, so we can say some resources are unemployed. Even though we have more, some more available. So some resources, look at this keyword, some resources are unemployed. We have the unemployment problems. Because of unemployment problems, we have more supply of the labor. So we said we have excess supply of labor. Do you agree? Why we have excess supply? This is because of unemployment. Once we have more excess supply of the labor, can you guess? This is in the long run. Price of the labor should be more or less once we have excess supply. Yes, yes, thank you. We have lower price. So we have price up. Think about labor is in the normal market. So price of labor will be lower. Price of labor will be lower. This price is nothing, but it is what we call the nominal wage. Nominal wage is lower. So once nominal wage is lower, so assume that price is fixed. Assume at the same price level. So if nominal wage lower, there is unchanged of the price level. So real wage will be lower. The real wage will be drop. Would you use more or less labor? Decision depends on the real wage. If real wage lower, we can afford more quantity of labor. So quantity of L will be higher. So we have the shift of aggregate supply to be higher, let's say to AS1. Where is the stop point of aggregate supply? It is this one. AS chip up to this much. Let's say this is AS1. Where we reach the new equilibrium, which is E1. Yes, we have a lower price to be P1, but right now, what we focus is in terms of the new equilibriums, which is Y1. So YF then equal to Y1. New equilibriums, we have Y equal to Y1. Right now, equal to Y full employment. So that this help correct the economy where we don't have gap. We have no gaps. No gaps means we don't have problems. So keep in mind that no matter what, we want to reach the full employment level. That is the ultimate goal. And why we have this kind of complicated, process of explaining, that is because we don't have the government. If we have the government, so life would be really easy. We shift AD to correct the gaps, and that's it. So the other way around, if we have the inflationary gaps, then thing would be in the opposite direction. So 10 more seconds. All right, almost done, almost done. The second case is what we call the inflationary gap. Why we have this one as a problem? This seemed not to be problem, but we said the situation seemed to be, too good to be true. Why? Look at this one. We have inflationary gap because actual GDP is greater than YF, full employment. How we can reach this one? Maybe we say it's too good to be true. And the reason to for this thing maybe because of we have the bubble economy or um, the middle the usual term to lower the negative side of this one is called we have inflation problem. And the magnitudes of these problems, the question is how to quantify the inflation problem. The measure of inflation problem we call inflationary gap. How much is the gap? Then we need to have the graph. Assume that in the macroeconomies, this is price and this is Y, AS and this is AD. So we have E0 where we have price equal to this much, P0, and this is, okay, and Y equal to this much, Y0. Assume that aggregate, no, full employment level is equal to this much, which is YF. So the problems of inflation is which is called inflationary gap equal to this much, or it's equal to the range of Y0 minus YF. So let's take the notes that without government, the long run adjustment would be without government help, once again, this is long run adjustments are as follow. Once again, without the government. So let's start from this one. Because of the inflationary situation, no matter what we said, economy is very good. Once economy is very good, assume that you are the producer. You would plan to produce more and more, right? Producer want to produce more. Want to produce more. How to produce more? use more labor, use or demand for more labor. However, this demand, which is more, is greater than the maximum level of labor, which is at the full employment. Am I right? Because full employment here, but we want to produce up here. It means that we demand for labor greater than the full employment level. So in this case, it's implied that in the labor market, we have excess demand for labor. Am I right? If you have excess demand for labor, what will be the next consequence? Price of labor should be more or less higher or lower? Higher, thank you. So price of labor, or previously we call the nominal wage, will be higher. Nominal wage is higher than real wage, also higher. Real wage higher, then this will lower the demand. The ability to use numbers of labor will be lower. When L is lower, then quantity of the goods to produce or is equal to aggregate supply will be lower to AS1. Because of what? Because of using L lower, excess labor, real wage, and nominal wage increase. Use L lower, aggregate supply shift to the left, equal to this much, to AS1. Then we have new equilibrium, which is E1. P increase to be P1. In the future time, in the long term, we have new equilibrium at E1. So we have Y equilibrium, which is Y1, exactly equal to YF, which is full employment level, which is this one. So we can say that this case as well, there is no gap or no recessionary problem. The gap was removed because of the long-term adjustment, even though we don't have the government. But the point is that we talk about long-term. So this is really broad definitions. Long-term is more than 1 year. When is the end of the long term then? It could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. There is one economist, a really famous one, said, in the long run, we are all die. Okay, which means we may not be able to see when the recessionary or the inflationary gaps would be removed from the economy. We cannot reach the long run. We cannot live until the long run ends. So we need the help from the government, which will start from the next lecture anyway. So any question? Oh my. Only supply in this case. Well, because we assume that there is no government. If government is here, then government would shift demand. All right, so that seemed to be all for today anyway. Well, before we finish, well, let's have a look on the remaining of the slides. Some of you may think that do we actually have recessionary and inflationary gap? The answer is yes. This is the potential GDP in case of Thailand, the gray line. The red orange one is what we call the actual GDP. You see, before COVID-19, actual GDP is more than the potential GDP. This implies that we have the inflation problems or the inflationary gaps, which is this much. So if it's not that much, we would say, well, there is no problems. Well, the government just try to correct and have a closer look what's happening here, even though there is not much of the impact in our entire economy. But right after COVID-19, 2019, okay, this is actual GDP. Sorry, actual GDP, the orange one, and this is the potential GDP. We have clearly what is called the recessionary gap because actual GDP less than the potential one. Okay, yeah, the last slide already. Can I wake you up? Okay, I'm gonna miss you so much. Well, you look so tired today. Well, let me ask you to do this one as homework then. Later, I will post it on Google Classroom. Please submit it there. Take this one as homework. So next week, we're gonna work this out together. Okay, what will be the guided solutions? And due by next week, we're gonna have the class on 2nd April, right? Let me ask you to submit one day before we have the regular class. Otherwise, you're gonna work, some of your friends will work it during the class. And during the class, we, try to finish this thing together. That's all for today. Any question, please? I will try my best to finish the grading of the midterm score by Friday or Saturday, and then I will send you an email later in case that you have any questions or you want to get some instructions. You want to have some consultations, send me an email. I hope all of you would be safe then. So that's all for today. Thank you very much and have a nice day, ครับ